Gay men who lived through the HIV epidemic of the 1980s, what was it like? A lot of folks have already commented here on the experience of living as gay men during that time, the confusion, the fear, the anger, and the guilt of survival. But that we hear so little about the role of lesbians during that time is an injustice that remains unaired and unaddressed. My testimony is limited to what I saw firsthand, but I believe that, were their contributions and experiences to be fully understood in retrospect, that lesbians who came to the aid of gay men at that time would be acknowledged as every bit as heroic as soldiers on the front lines of any war. A claim like that requires some heavy backup, and I'm not confident I can provide it in this post. It's one of my ambitions to be able to do so in my lifetime. But what I can tell you now is that these women walked directly into the fire and through it, and they did not have to. And that they did it even as some of the gay men they took care of treated them with bitchiness, scorn, and contempt. It was, at the time, not at all unusual for gay men to snicker as the bulldyke walked into the bar with her overalls and flannels and fades. Much of the time, it was casual ribbing which they took in stride. But it could also be laced with acid, especially when lesbians began gravitating toward a bar that had until then catered largely to men. When the AIDS crisis struck, it would be many of these same women who would go straight from their jobs during the day to acting as caregivers at night. Because most of them lacked medical degrees, they were generally relegated to the most unpleasant tasks, wiping up puke and shit, cleaning up houses and apartments neglected for weeks and months. But not being directly responsible for medical care also made them the most convenient targets for the devastating anger and rage these men felt, many who'd been abandoned by their own family and friends. These women walked directly into the fire. They came to the aid of gay men even when it was unclear how easily the virus could be transmitted. Transmission via needle stick was still a concern, so they often wore 2 or 3 layers of latex gloves to protect themselves. But more than once I saw them, in their haste and frustration, dispense with the gloves so that they could check for fevers, or hold a hand that hung listlessly from the edge of a bed whose sheets they had just laundered. They provided aid, comfort, and medical care to men withering away in hospices, men who'd already lost their lovers and friends to the disease and spent their last months in agony. They'd been abandoned by their own families, and were it not for lesbians, many if not most of them volunteers, they would have suffered alone. And when there was nothing more medicine could do for them and their lungs began to fill with fluid, it was often these same women who'd be left to administer enough morphine to release them, given to them by the doctor who had left the room and would return 15 minutes later to sign the certificate, a common practice at the time. I knew a woman around that time who'd had at one point been making bank in construction. But at the outset of the AIDS crisis she had abandoned her career to pursue nursing instead, and was close to her degree when we were hanging out. She was a big, hearty drinker, unfortunately so was I. We'd been utterly thrashed at a bar once when someone whispered a fairly benign but nonetheless unwelcoming comment about her. Middle fingers were exchanged, and afterwards, furious and indignant, I asked her, "Why do you do it? Why did you abandon a career to take care of these assholes who still won't pay you any respect?" She cut me a surprisingly severe look, held it and said, "Honey, because no one else is going to do it." I remember feeling ashamed after that, because my fury and indignation weren't going to clean blood and puke off the floor. It wasn't going to do the shit that needed to get done. HIV killed my friends, took my lover from me, and tore up my life. During that time, I did what I could. But nothing I did then or have ever been called to do in my life puts me anywhere near the example set by the lesbians I knew in the 80s and 90s. I've felt obligated to remember what they did, and to make sure other people remember it too. So, thanks to the OP, this is as good a place to start as any. Yes. Thank you for this post. Our sister lesbians took on the care of these AIDS patients because no one else would. They were angels, and gave comfort to those dying. Edit, I have to add, that not once did I ever hear them complain. They just stepped up to the plate, and did it. I'm humbled by their compassion and generosity. In the 80s, I watched my best friend, my other gay friends, and my uncle struggle with HIV and its impact on their lives. Getting HIV was still pretty much a death sentence and was viewed with great dread. People would get diagnosed and die within a few years. The newspaper would have obituaries of all these young men. It was depressing. Information about avoiding and preventing HIV infection was still new and evolving. Of course, using condoms was emphasized, but at first, the medical community didn't realize that lambskin condoms didn't provide the needed protection. I don't even think you can get lambskin condoms anymore, but in the 80s, because condoms were seen as a contraceptive and not as a preventer of illness, lambskin condoms were a common choice. I was completely surprised when my best friend told me he was HIV positive. I had previously asked about his condom usage because, well, he was my best friend and I didn't want him to get HIV. He assured me he was safe. So when he did tell me about his diagnosis, I asked what the hell happened. Turns out, my best friend got HIV because he had had sex with a guy using lambskin condoms and not latex condoms. And they had used lambskin condoms because they didn't know they shouldn't. After my friend became ill, he struggled with how and what to tell his employer. He was an engineer working in oil and gas. He didn't expect that his co-workers would react kindly to an HIV positive man. He only told everyone he had cancer but not about the HIV status which brought on the cancer. The time from his initial HIV positive diagnosis to his death was 4 years, though he wasn't diagnosed with the cancer until about 6 months before he died. My uncle, on the other hand, was diagnosed sometime in the very late 80s. He told me in 1990 and lived until 2003. He was pretty ill the last few years, struggling with colorectal cancer for about 4 years. I was not surprised that he contracted HIV. He had been taking me to gay bars since I was a teenager in the late 70s and I was well aware of how promiscuous he was. I had heard stories of his trips to clinics to treat the various STDs he had gotten over the years. He came of age in the few years before the AIDS crisis and I don't think he was ever really able to change his behavior to protect himself. I still miss my friend and my uncle and I wish I could go back in time to the 80s and tell them what I know now so they would be safe and still alive. It was madness. It was terribly cruel. It was inexplicable and unexplained. For a very long time. Research was underfunded, and in many cases large institutions and public figures rooted for it to be happening. People died suddenly of unexplainable things. Toe fungus. Tongue thrush. Rashes. Eyes welling up with blood. Horrible shit. Everyone knew it was hitting gay men. Nobody knew what it was. They called it the gay cancer. People were very superstitious. I had handfuls of groceries and man lectured me on not pressing the elevator buttons with my nose because I could catch AIDS from it. Yes. That happened. My aunt worked in Bellevue, one nurse alone, tending to over 30 guys at a pop. Nobody even came near them. Nobody knew how it was spread. Nobody wanted to touch them. And they were so often such incredible people. Young men who had come to Nick to make a name for themselves, the cream of the crop in their tiny little towns, and it hit most of them fast, killed you in weeks. Pianists, playwrights, actors, designers, architects, it cut a swath through the theater world. It wasn't just promiscuous behavior, nobody knew how it was spread. Everyone was fucking. You have to understand, we had had a sexual revolution and it was late 70s early 80s. They had cured the clap. Women were on the pill. Who needs antique inventions like condoms? Nobody used that stuff. Men can't get pregnant. And again, it was not clear at all how it was contagious. Funding was slow to arrive. The disease was not even named for some time. Support for a cure rallied around innocent victims like little kids. Ryan White. Like being a single guy, working at an architecture firm in the city, living on Fire Island in a nice colonial that you had restored yourself, going out on dinner dates looking for companionship, was some terrible moral situation that deserved death. The death toll was incredible and ongoing for decades, and that suited some people just fine. Google the size of the AIDS quilt for context. It didn't touch me very much. Full disclosure, I am not a gay man, but I was alive and aware in the 80s. My neighbor died, my other neighbor died, my godfather died, my teenage friend from college died, a friend of my dad's died, actually many friends of my dad died. He was an actor so he knew more people than I did. In the great American tradition of abandoning your gay relatives, they typically died alone in hospital beds far from family. People died in days, weeks, very fast. It ate them alive. Nobody lived years back then. My aunt from Bellevue's best friend John Cassavetes died. Great director and actor. That was a hard phone call to listen to. So many great actors. Holy God. So many talented people. I've spoken about it here before, but it's worth mentioning. You would have had gay marriage in the 90s if those people had been alive to fight for it. Our lives are all poorer for the loss of the gay community of those days, and in many cases, the deaths were preventable by outreach and info that did not arrive in time. In my day, student organizations and homegrown movements like ACT UP just started distributing information and condoms to as many people as possible in all the clubs and parades and etc. Banging on the doors for funding and research. They did a shit ton of good. In the 90s they were disbanded and then taken over by nuts. Long story short, no radical organization in the USA is allowed to be too powerful for too long. But they did good while they were most needed, and many of my friends owe their lives to those cheap shitty condoms. TLDR, God bless cheap shitty condoms. Stay safe, kids. Thank you for watching. I hope the video was informative. Subscribe to okpj for more Ask Reddit videos that deal with sexuality, illness, and mental health, amongst other topics, every single day. See you tomorrow.